¿Estamos listos para empezar? Ok, chévere.
Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. En breves minutos.
Good morning. We will soon begin the event. We're waiting for attendees to connect. And in a few minutes, we will also connect so that we can broadcast live through social media. We will be live on YouTube, on YouTube's channel of Cepaz, in fact.
Buenos días a todos y a todas. Vamos a dar
Good morning. We are going to wait just a few minutes to allow for attendees to connect to our Zoom event, and we will soon begin the event. Thank you very much for your patience.
para quienes se están conectando en este momento.
For those who are joining us, if you need simultaneous interpretation, there will be Spanish, English, simultaneous interpretation. You can click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of the website and choose your language of preference.
And you can register in the box below to have the interpretation. Okay, vamos entonces a dar inicio.
Let's begin today's event. From Foro Cívico and its member organizations, all of them, and together with WOLA support, we would like to welcome you to this event named The Role of the UN and the EU in Promoting Free and Fair Elections in Venezuela, how elections can be enhanced through technical assistance. We would like to greet all the attendees that are with us here today. We've had an amazing response. We see a great deal of interest. Given the number of attendees that we have, we would like also to greet the representative of the different diplomatic missions, the people from the European Union, the United Nations, from its electoral division, as well as the representatives from the Interparliamentary Union. As a reminder, those that are joining us, for those that are joining us just now, we are providing simultaneous interpretation, so you can choose the language of your preference, and then we will have some presentations and you can also share comments, questions through the chat or through the Q&A icon that you have at the bottom of your screen. Now, without further ado, we are going to begin the event, and I would just like to say that civil society organizations have been documenting since 2015 the violations to human rights in electoral processes, and There have been denounces to international organizations in Venezuela, but also at an international level, given the loss of institutionality and independence of Venezuelan institutions. There's been an undermining to the right to vote and lack of trust by the citizens as an instrument of social transformation. You can see all this through different reports that have been published by the different civil society organizations that have a presence in Venezuela and that are dealing with electoral processes in this country. Since 2018, we've seen a deepening of the humanitarian crisis that we have in Venezuela. Since in 2018, what happened with the elections affected really the political rights of Venezuelans, and it led to lack of credibility and trust in elections to recover democracy in Venezuela. Civil society organizations have been working really hard and discussing all this, using all those documents to back us up. Like I said, we've seen an undermining of electoral processes, and therefore there is a need to rebuild electoral processes in Venezuela. We've been working really hard for many years to document all this. And having done so, we could understand not only the dimensions of the problem, but also it allowed us to have a discussion about how in this situation where there's lack of trust and lack of guarantees of rights, we could actually do something so that through peaceful and electoral means, we could solve the crisis and continue to work on recovering democracy. And this is where Diálogo Social, which is a network of several civil society organizations, we started a very intense discussion with different roundtables. This has allowed us to see the role that civil society organizations could play in terms of defending democracy, and also how important they are in order to defend democracy and rights to recover electoral processes. There was a very intense debate and consultation among the different stakeholders, and 4 reports have been published in this regard. The first, and they've been called On Our Way to Democracy. They happened between 2019 and 2020. Today, we will be presenting one of these reports, and it talks specifically about electoral assistance as a key factor in this strategy. All this has allowed us to get to 2020 convinced, or rather 2021, convinced that in order to recover democracy, we need to recover and rebuild electoral processes. There is a lack of trust and lack of guarantees, but we need citizens' action in order to so that they can exercise their rights. We need to focus on people. We need to have political agreements that focus on obviously alleviating the crisis in Venezuela, but also we need to work to recover democracy, to recover electoral processes in the country. We are fully convinced in Foro Cívico, and that's we have promoted this event and we're holding this event. Electoral processes are a cross-cutting factor in our work. We're working with different stakeholders, and we are in constant discussions with international organizations, specifically with the United Nations, because they play a key role in this context. Today, we wanted to expand this discussion and include what we believe is an absolutely necessary action. We continue to work documenting what is happening and in order to exercise our rights, but we also need political agreements to move forward in this regard. A proof of this was not only the independent candidates for the CNE, but also the work that is being done in order to recover those electoral processes to reestablish democracy in Venezuela. Today, we would like to say that it's absolutely necessary to have the support of electoral assistance, not only for the next elections, but also in the long term. Something that was destroyed throughout time will not be rebuilt overnight. It will take time. We need to take steps forward, not backwards. We need to keep progressing, moving forward, and do something that was thought to be impossible, which is to have real elections, exercising our own rights, our capacity to achieve agreements. in this process, the role of the UN, the international community, the EU is absolutely vital. We believe Venezuela needs international support and assistance in order to rebuild this path towards democracy. And obviously, electoral assistance is a key factor in this whole process. And today we're going to talk about how this will be possible. In order to do so, we have 3 high-level professionals that are fully committed to Venezuela. Their work has been absolutely key. We have Eugenio Martinez, Domenico Tuccinardi, and Griselda Colina. We will have a roundtable with them. They will offer different approaches, but their insights will allow us to see how this is possible in Venezuela in order to continue to move forward and rebuild that path toward democracy. Eugenio Martinez is a journalist that analyzes political affairs. Domenico Tuccinardi is a senior analyst of the EDGE Foundation, and Griselda Colina is vice president of the National Electoral Council and promoter of Foro Cívico. It is a pleasure to have this discussion with all of you. And without further ado, I would like to offer the floor to Eugenio Martinez as the first of our speakers. And we really hope it's very useful to you all. Welcome, Eugenio. Welcome, Domenico and Griselda. The floor is yours. Thank you for your attention. Eugenio, the floor is yours. Go ahead. Thank you, Bibi. I would like to thank all the participants that are here with us today. In order to talk about electoral assistance in Venezuela, it's absolutely key. First, to remember how we got to this point, why we are having this forum, this discussion. It is clear that no electoral system or electoral authority can actually guarantee the trust in the electoral process and its results. Trust in electoral processes begins with a series of factors such as impartial administration of elections, legal certainty, clear legal framework, clear rules, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, in Venezuela, with its political system, we don't have these actors. And that's what happened with the elections in December 2020. It had very technical, restrictive conditions, the most strict conditions in the last 20 years. But this didn't happen only in December. It's been a slow and ongoing process. For example, in 2012, we started seeing a worsening of political parties. Certain actions were taking place out of legality, banning some political actors from participating since 2005, also restricting Venezuelans out of the country to vote. And that started more or less in 2010. In 2017, we saw the main strength of our elections, which is the automatized system, in another weakness. Also, international observation missions were undermined in since 2005, have been undermined. And all these milestones have been taking place, and they led to what happened in 2020. The recovery of the guarantees that have been lost will also be a systematic process that will take place. The new CNE is a cornerstone, but in order to have the right conditions to recover the right to vote, and the change is not only, will only be achieved by having the CNE, we will need much more. Technical assistance and electoral observation will play a key role, not only to have elections at a specific time, but in order to have a process that has to be understood in the medium and long term. In Venezuela, we need to work on reestablishing electoral conditions, for sure, that's obvious, but we also need to repeat that so that we can have fair elections where the rules are the same for all stakeholders, where the rules are transparent, votes are counted in a transparent manner, and the principle of one person, one vote, and for that person to vote freely and without coercion is absolutely key. In order to recover this right to vote is a key step in order to transition to democracy. And in order to do so, we need everyone to contribute to this effort, both within Venezuela as well as outside of Venezuela. It will not be achieved by helping just one group of society. We need everyone to be able to vote. Otherwise, it will be an absolute failure of Venezuelans, but also the international community.
Ayuda, asistencia, monitoreo.
Venezuela, we now need support to solve the judicial process and the political situation of our parties, to guarantee freedom of expression for the media, and to audit the process, the automized process that is now being developed. And in this, we need to also put an end to political suspensions and identify those issues. And in these issues, we need to interrupt the common practice of having political representatives visit the polls and interfere with the process. So in this sense, also, we need to update the electoral census and to include in the process all of those Venezuelans that were forced to leave the country. We're talking about 1.5 million Venezuelans that do not have the right to participate in the process, and because of their circumstances, cannot even have their own identity abroad. We need to fix the process, also to ensure safety measures in terms of health to avoid further spread of COVID, to also modify the administrative structure to reflect what has been established by the Constitution. And for this, we need all the conditions and guarantees that are common to an electoral process. These are essential measures and elements which bring us today to this discussion. And as we talked about in the introduction, the loss of conditions and guarantees has been a gradual process. With every electoral process, we saw how we lost a component or an element that allowed us to guarantee free and fair elections. So recovering all these conditions will also be a progressive transition. So we cannot focus on one particular aspect. Rather, we should focus on a process, a cycle that will start in the upcoming elections and that will culminate in a final process that will be held in 2024 with the presidential elections. So this electoral cycle that starts in November 21st will allow us to integrate changes until 2024. So rather than having an electoral process that is successful, what Venezuelans need is to set a foundation that will allow us to build peace, to also recover citizens' confidence in the process, and to have a democratic structure. The UN and the EU have an essential role when it comes to guaranteeing an electoral process, especially when it comes to managing crisis we're facing in Venezuela. In the case of the UN, they have specialized institutions of the electoral assistance within the Department of Public Assistance and Peace Consolidation. And they could have an essential role when it comes to the reconstruction of a peaceful Venezuela, reestablishing institutions and the electoral process, as it was the case of Cambodia in 1952 or East Timor in 1997, of course, with every difference that each process has. But what is important is to remember that within the UN, this process has a series of elements that the organization can include and defend, such as human rights, democracy, post-conflict assistance, decolonization, And the UN has different areas of action: technical assistance, observation of the electoral process. And among the conditions that have been degraded or that we have lost along the process, it seems essential that technical assistance will be essential when it comes to recovering all those elements that we have lost in the past years. Of course, without forgetting the importance that an observation mission coming from the European Union can have within the country. In the past, we've had assistance from the UN in a technical mission. And it's not surprising that in the recommendations proposed in 2006 by the European Union, they state requirements that still have not been satisfied. Considering the time that has passed since 2006, those recommendations should still be fulfilled. And with this, I would just like to highlight that it is true that the political system, the electoral system of the country has been eroded along the years, but we also need suggestions from experts that will allow us to also carry out a supervision, monitoring of the process, and also participate with their assistance in the negotiation. I'm going to close. They've asked me to stick to 10 minutes. So just to conclude, every resolution or solution for this crisis is fundamented in a political solution. And this is what most civil society organizations are asking for. And it was also reiterated by the UN Secretary General. And this solution should be built on the respect of and defense of civic rights. In order to do this, we also need the support of the UN assistance and the European Union. Thank you. Thank you, Eugenio, for following our time recommendations and also for your recommendations included in this document. I've shared a link in the chat of this document. He is part of the authors of this report that describes what we see within Foro Cívico and the dialogue with civil society. It also includes a reflection and conclusions of the many measures that could be considered as a solution. I'm offering now the floor to Domenico Tucinardi, who is a senior advisor of EDGE Foundation, and it is a privilege for us to have his vision in this conversation. He has a comparative vision that has a broad understanding of how electoral processes function in many other countries, and his comments are of great value to us. Thank you, Beatriz, and thank you to Foro Cívico for giving me the opportunity to talk about this country that is so dear to me in such an important moment. We are following very closely the different developments coming from Venezuela. So I'm going to focus on the last observations that Eugenio shared about technical assistance and observation missions. And I'm not sure if you can see my screen, if you can share my presentation. These are my personal observations of what electoral assistance means, its history. I'm not speaking in name of the UN or the European Union. I have been part of some missions, but these are not the official position of these institutions. I participated in observation missions in 2005 with the European Union, and I was also head of some missions at the European Union. So I'm talking as Domenico Tucinardi, and I would like to start with the definitions. So what kind of definitions can we apply when it comes to electoral assistance? So first of all is offering advice in the area of legal assistance, technical, financial assistance, identifying resources to be able to hold free and fair and transparent elections. And it's based on legal requirements and obligations that are included in international treaties or have been established by the countries themselves and were not imposed by third parties. So the idea is to understand how a country can comply with its own obligations. It also means to manage a very complex system of different actors, electoral organizations, international observations, political parties, the civil society, service providers, and the media. And it is essential that this assistance be perceived as an impartial technical support. It's also important to highlight how in the past 20 years, this assistance has evolved. It has gone from being support during the day of the election to ensure a transparent process on the day of the elections to a broader support. So nowadays, we've identified also how important the period before and after the elections is, which also requires a constant contact with the institutions to recalibrate constantly our action. And it also requires to participate with different forums. And it talks about also how different actors influence the process. And when it comes to the key players, and we talk about electoral assistance, although some of the activities have been part of foreign relations and part of the agenda of foreign relations, it was part also of a result of the Second World War, a result of decolonization and democratization of the process. And with the end of the Cold War, the support of transparent governments has been also recognized as a priority when it comes to creating peaceful and economical sustainable democracies. So historically, we can highlight three actors: the UN, the European Union, and the US. At a regional level, we have specific actors that have had great impact in specific situations, and of course, following whatever they included in their charter. So we have the OAS, in the Americas hemisphere, the African Union in Africa, and it could be the case for other regions. We have other actors such as the Center of Inter-American Institution and the National Democratic Institution. And they work for the democratic sustainability in certain regions such as Africa. And they also work when it comes to supporting the observation process. We have IFES.
There are other actors too. I'm just listing the main ones here, and then we can talk more in detail about the others later on. It's important to highlight how the initial commitment of all those actors had to do mainly with electoral observation services, and that has evolved throughout the years. If we are talking about UN assistance, the first mission of assistance was with the Trust Administration Council, observation and supervision in more than 30 election processes and referenda throughout the world during the decolonization stage. And after that first era of the UN assistance, then we moved on to the 1980s and late 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, where we saw a very important change in terms of how the UN was providing assistance. I would like to highlight three very important different types of assistance. And I'm highlighting one example per type so we can remember the importance of this type of mission and the characteristics of each one of them. In 1989, in Namibia, which was about supervision and electoral control. In 1993, it was in Cambodia, organization and management of the elections themselves. And in 1994, ONUSAL, El Salvador was about verification. And at that time, we started also seeing the need within the United Nations to take into account all the lessons learned throughout the years in terms of the different missions so that the work could be systematized through a regular resolution of the General Assembly, which is called Enhancing the Principle of Periodic and Genuine Elections. And that was in 1991. So ever since, every 2 or 3 years, there is a new resolution passed, which basically takes into account the situation regarding the assistance in each one of the countries. We've talked about technical assistance for the electoral entity in each one of the countries, as well as national institutions. We've talked about supervision and certification, observation. Sometimes you have groups of experts, and then logistical and operational support to citizens' observation. And then there are other types of support, such as creating, for example, a conducive political and administrative environment in order to celebrate elections. I think there are types of assistance that are very rare today. For example, supervision and certification. This took place mainly during decolonization processes, the first elections, while transitioning toward democracy. The objective of this type of assistance was to guarantee the right to self-determination. And the last case was in Namibia in 1989. In terms of certification, this type of mission is to certify the credibility of all the different aspects of an electoral process that has taken place through the National Electoral Authority. It took place mainly at the beginning of the 1990s, and specific examples are Angola, El Salvador, Haiti, Nicaragua, and sometimes it was because the structure was in place, but there was no trust on the national entities. The last missions of this nature were East Timor in 2007 and Côte d'Ivoire in 2010. Observation. This is the most typical type of assistance to electoral processes, or rather, the most rare one by the UN. It requires a request by the government and a mandate by the Security Council or the General Assembly of the UN. It's most of the times discouraged to avoid conflict of interest with its main support, a type of support, which is technical assistance. And over the last 20 years, this has been by other organizations such as the OAS or the European Union, organizations that have specialized in this type of activity and they have a comparative advantage. The United Nations continue to participate in developing the methodology, the observation methodology through events that take place every year, but most of the times they prefer not to take part in this type of assistance. Over the last 20 years, we've only seen 2 cases, Fiji Islands in 2001 and Burundi 2005. And I actually participated as a technical expert. There's also groups of experts in specific cases and by request of the host country. The Secretary General can actually deploy experts to monitor specific parts of an electoral process. For example, after a long transition period, these groups of experts most of the times assess the political and technical aspects of celebrating elections. They write an internal report for the Secretary General through the focal point. They work in a very discreet, impartial, and focused manner. They really focus on assessing the electoral process, and they don't really express publicly. They don't express their opinion publicly. Examples: Nepal 2008, Sudan 2011, Algeria 2012-14. Over the last 20 years, they focused mainly on electoral assistance, and in order to do so, we need 2 requirements: a mandate by the Security Council or the General Assembly with an official request by the member state or a territory. Then the coordinator of electoral assistance affairs must assess the needs and consult with the pertinent United Nations entities within the country. Or different agencies within the United Nations system that have more experience in the country. And then we have a coordinator for electoral affairs, which is the coordinator. This coordinator is the general within the Adjunct General Secretariat for Political Affairs and Peacekeeping. And they design and support processes every year in they're working on more than 50 countries. Next slide, please. This assistance is provided through different processes and projects that are managed by the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Human Rights or other entities within the United Nations. It's important that the assistance time is within a specific time frame. They need to contact the coordinator before they start with the assistance. Today, we're focusing in the long term, therefore, they take into account different factors in order to provide long-term assistance throughout the whole electoral cycle in the country. In terms of the content of the technical assistance, we have the following. There are 3 or 4. The first one, most of the times a group of experts is deployed and they work together with the electoral authority in the country, and they can analyze any type of aspect within the electoral process, from legal assistance in terms of analyzing the laws and the regulations, to logistical and operational support, always working together with the National Electoral Authority. They also focus on strengthening electoral institutions, capacity building, and so on and so forth. And there's other types of technical support that they can provide. And they can delegate also to other specialized entity. But basically, it's about training, for example, the judiciary, because they are the ones who make the decision about the results of the elections, then support and training for security forces, monitoring of the media, technical assistance in order to register political parties, and so on and so forth. Then there are some basic principles when it comes to assistance. They're based on different directives that have been approved, and you can find them in the United Nations website. Basically, they focus on context, basically what the country is facing and the need that they're facing in spite of everything that has been done to date, respect for human rights, such as Eugenia mentioned, sovereign, or rather national sovereignty and ownership. And the translation of ownership into Spanish is complicated, but basically is to give ownership to the national institutions. This is absolutely fundamental. And then the long-term approach in order to generate a discussion as things that we could talk about later on. For example, would be the request for assistance, when it was made, if it was made. That's important in order to determine the different time frame and deadlines to assess the needs and later on come up with support hypotheses. In this process, we need to have the largest national political support in the country. It's important to discuss all this to see if we have the right conditions in terms of security, for example. What type of support the United Nations could deploy to guarantee safety and security during the electoral process. For example, in this case, now we have a pandemic. There are very specific measures that could be implemented, learned from other countries that carried out elections in the midst of the pandemic. Then the timeline in the country, as well as the temporary approach for this assistance. The different projects, assistance project, can be designed in very different ways, depending on whether it's a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year program, and so on and so forth. But it's very important to have a clear analysis of the different needs in order to know how long the assistance needs to be in place. And then it's also paramount to count on all the different stakeholders, to have all of them involved in order to provide this assistance. The European Union, through the different programs, or other specific stakeholders that could also provide different types of assistance to civil society, as well as other actors. It's important to have a clear idea of the availability of the different stakeholders in order to know what would work best for each one of the sectors that request assistance. I think I'm going to stop here. And I hope I made sense, because I tried to cover a lot of material in just 10 minutes. Thank you very much. This general overview has been extremely useful for us, because it will allow us to understand how feasible it is to have a UN assistance mission. And now Gisela is going to talk about these challenges that you just mentioned. I would like to introduce Griselda Colina. She's a friend, she's a colleague, and this topic is especially interesting for both of us. We've been talking about it for many years. We tried to analyze it from a national standpoint, international standpoint, understanding all the different opportunities that are in place right now. Since she is part of the CNE, the National Electoral Council, there are different opportunities here. We've been talking about this issue since 2018, but now we have a real possibility to make it true. Welcome, Griselda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Bibi, and it is definitely a pleasure and a great pride for me to be part of this. I would like to also thank my colleagues from Foro Cívico that allow me to participate in these kinds of exchanges. I'd like to thank WOLA as well for creating this space. And also thank you to Eugenio Martinez for participating in such an important event that has become a priority to us, the idea of electoral systems that will allow us to have free and fair elections in Venezuela, which has always been perceived as a way to also intervene or participate in this process as a civil society, as part of the civil society.
Yo justamente quería hablar de cómo desde el Foro Cívico estamos viendo las elecciones libres en Venezuela.
So I wanted to talk about how Foro Cívico is seeing these elections from our standpoint and how this is part of an element to solve the crisis. So first of all, I wanted to say that from our point of view is that there is a crisis, and the solution to this crisis is not a starting point. It's part of a process that we all need to be part of, a process that has already started and that needs the participation of a coordinated international institution, a participation from abroad that is also coordinated with the will of the Venezuelan people. So it's important to see that this solution requires participation of Venezuelans, a process that includes concepts like negotiation is possible. So in many cases, Vivi and I have been part of spaces or areas that were not considered very popular. And today, it seems essential to bring these concepts back to the conversation. One of the aspects that we would like to also highlight is how throughout the time we have identified the elements or conditions that are important or essential to have a free election in Venezuela. And first, we identified a series of elements like arbitration, political pluralism, and have an electoral registry of voters that would guarantee their full participation in the process. Venezuelans that are not part of the process, and also Venezuelans that have left the country, those 5 million Venezuelans that were forced to leave the country. But it also was highlighted through the consultations we had with experts to include the idea of international observation. And this allowed us to understand that when it comes to respecting the people's will and the results of the process, and as part of the entire process itself, it was essential to have these elements in place to have a fair election in Venezuela. And in this sense, the strategy that we have followed within the civil society through Diálogo Social and through Foro Cívico was to document, to demand, and participate. Those were the three core elements. So a few years ago, we started a joint action between the different organizations to follow how the electoral process was being developed, the parliamentary election process. And here you have preliminary reports and then a final report that had a title that referred to the loss of opportunity because we lost the opportunity to launch a reinstitutionalization process within the country. So we started monitoring the process within this new National Assembly. And we found that there was also an opportunity to create a new CNE. So for this, we presented a series of candidates, 2 people of our trust, 2 representatives of the civil society with outstanding CVs. And we also presented different candidates to lead the CNE. Here we have the 15 candidates that we presented and nominated. We did it without no certainty, without that certainty of being able to achieve anything, but with the conviction that we had the right to participate. So this led us to what we call the first step, in which 5 of those 15 candidates that were nominated to the CNE were appointed. And here is a picture that is a witness to the nomination: Leo Garismendi, Francisco Martinez, myself, and the chair. And another positive step was the creation of the secondary institutions, órganos subordinados in Spanish. And these also guarantee and regulate the other elements. We have Enrique Marquez, that was not nominated by the civil society, but he is part of the official sector. And we also saw that it was positive that the director was part of the National Electoral Board. A third step, which I believe is also important to highlight, and in this sense, we need to also understand how we have slowly started gaining a little bit more of ground. Although it's not enough, it's important to highlight the steps that we have taken, the progress we've made in a very challenging sphere, but in which we have achieved great progress as well. So another important step was what happened on May 11th, in which they announced a commitment for electoral conditions that highlighted an audit of the electoral system and the electronic electoral registry to guarantee free-flowing registration process, also reviewing suspensions through the controller and the Superior Court of Justice in the country, and also the review of amendments to the rules of procedure. So at this point, we've only gone through the first 55 days. And it's important to highlight that within those 55 days, we had several positive announcements. First of all, that between June 1st and July 15th, we will see an exercise put in place to review the electoral registry, to highlight different areas in which citizens have not been able to register to vote, people that have changed their place of residence will be able to be part of the process. And this is a revision that had not been carried out since 2016. We are covering a series of cases. There's a lot of work to be done, but we're still in a positive situation. From June 14th to July 26th, we will be carrying out an audit that will allow us to review the automized voting system, the automatic and electronic voting system, that will allow us to review this with the support of experts from national universities, and that is open to those who are interested in the process, that can participate of it and understand the audit's final results. After that, we will have a report with recommendations from the Electoral Council, and would allow us to have enough time to include the recommendations for the electoral process on November 21st. On June 25, we had a meeting between the European Union delegation in Venezuela and the CNE to announce the electoral observation of the European Union to the process. Of course, this step, the final decision, does not fall under the Electoral Council, but it is a positive sign to have that joint press release between the European Union, the US, and Canada that call on to electoral process with conditions that will allow for the compliance of international standards for regional and local elections in November 2021. We believe this is part of a very important process, a process that is part of a joint action that is still in a preliminary phase, but that is gaining traction and recognition. And finally, we believe that it's important to have had that announcement from the government to put an end to the protective measures that were put in place to create protectorates, to take away power from other representatives. The fact that the President of the Republic has announced that they will put an end to protectorates is a very positive sign as well. And finally, the Electoral Council has had the opportunity to establish that link with electoral observations. It is an important sign, and the chair of the CNE also says that from May 2021, since May 17th, they extended an invitation to the European Union and the UN to participate in the process. And in June 21st, Josep Borrell announced that they will be sending a technical mission to Venezuela. And on June 25th, the representative of the European Union announced that technical mission that will be visiting the country. So finally, I believe that as Foro Cívico, but also as part of the CNE, where I'm a vice principal, What we want to signal is that we are looking for solutions for Venezuelans, and that these solutions need to crystallize in measures that not only address causes and consequences, but the origins as well. I believe that there is a change to recover this electoral process, and that is essential also to reinstall a democratic institution, but it has to be human focused. We believe that Venezuela is not a country that is holding elections in normal conditions. We are facing a complex humanitarian crisis in which the UN is already offering assistance, humanitarian assistance, and in which we have also seen reports of human rights violations. And we believe that electoral assistance is a strategic mechanism. And I would like to also highlight what Eugenio mentioned. This is a cycle. This is an electoral cycle. It isn't focused on just one event. It's part of an entire solution that will allow us to build a free and fair electoral process to guarantee peace in Venezuela.
Thank you, Griselda. Thank you to all those that are here with us. Instead of losing participants, there are people still joining. So thank you very much. Also, thanks to the presence of different missions from international organizations, because this conversation, we want to have it with different stakeholders, such as the European Union. Also, thank you to WOLA, who has really assisted us in terms of facilitating this space and allowing us to have actors from the United States who also play a key role in Venezuela. The international community in general, as a whole, different Latin American countries and European countries that have shown a great deal of solidarity with the situation in Venezuela and the possibility of generating political agreements. I think we are now at the time that everyone was waiting for, which was the discussion where the people can ask questions. I think the overview provided by the speakers has been excellent. We have different questions here that I will read. I think questions are for specific speakers, but then also comments. We have the first question by Oriana Guerra. I think Domenico already answered part of this question, but maybe he could say something else. What is the right procedure for the UN to send an observation mission? Daniel Cooper Bermudez also asked, the electoral observation mission of the European Union, can it produce some sort of assessment to promote technical assistance, a process of technical assistance provided by the United Nations? And then Lina Jacqueline Mendoza. Good morning. For Venezuelans that are outside of the country, has anything been achieved? Can we offer some data and say what's happening in terms of our right to vote? We still have time, so please make sure that you type it in the Q&A box, and we will read them 3 by 3, and they will be answered by the speakers. In whatever order you want, speakers can take the floor and answer the questions, the 3 first questions that I have just posed. Domenico, I can actually start answering the question about a mission, a UN mission for electoral observation. Like I said before, this happens in very rare situations when the United Nations observe elections in a country. We need a request by the country and then a mandate by the Security Council or the General Assembly. And like I said before, the United Nations prefers to leave other specialized organizations to do so. The United Nations continue to supervise the methodology of the electoral observation process, but they prefer to focus on the other side of the spectrum, which is the provision of electoral assistance. Instead of observing the work that they carry out, they prefer to separate those two things and focus exclusively on electoral assistance. The second question was about what can a EU electoral mission do in order to help a mission by the United Nations. They must, in fact, do something in that regard. International organizations need to coordinate among each other, among themselves. And that's the most important thing that is provided to the host country and the different organizations that are involved in the observation. For example, an assessment. The preliminary assessment that is carried out takes into account recommendations by the observation mission of the European Union, as well as all the recommendations issued by all the different organizations that carry out observation tasks nationally and internationally. I think I've addressed both questions, but I don't know if I left any questions unanswered. I don't know if Griselda have any Eugenio, have any comments? I can answer the question by Jacqueline. She was asking about the participation of Venezuelans that live abroad, and this is something that worries all Venezuelans and is part of constant discussions that we are holding with the different members of the Foro Cívico and the National Electoral Council. It has to do with the participation of all Venezuelans, in terms of this process, national, regional, and local. The Venezuelans that are out of Venezuela cannot vote, but we understand that that's a right that needs to be respected. Therefore, we need to address this issue, taking into account all the different complexities. For example, there are many Venezuelans that first need to recover the right for identity. Many Venezuelans abroad do not have documents to prove their identity. So that's a very complex issue, but we are certainly addressing it. For this electoral process that we have upcoming, Venezuelans out of the country will not be able to vote, but we need to see this issue as part of the process. We need to recover the vote of those that live outside of Venezuela. Thank you, Griselda, for your answer. Eugenio, I don't know if you would like to add anything to what has already been said regarding the questions that I posed. Yes, I do want to add something, especially regarding Venezuelans abroad. That's quite a complex matter, as Griselda said. They will not be able to vote for regional or local elections. However, a vote, for example, for a national referendum, they need to have that vote, and that's a priority. There are different issues here. They're political, technical, as well as legal problems that need to be solved in order for this to happen. Griselda was talking about one of the priorities, which was to restore the right for an identity. But once that is done, legal obstacles need to be overcome. For example, legal residency in the country where they will vote. However, most of the Venezuelan immigrants do not have this legal residency. Then we also have to remember that the vote of Venezuelans abroad is included in the Constitution as something anecdotal, because we were not a country of migrants in the past. The situation has changed, and we are talking now about 4 million Venezuelans that should have the right to vote, that live abroad, and that their vote could be decisive in an electoral process. Therefore, we need to overcome the technical obstacles for these Venezuelans abroad to be able to vote. And we also need political solutions to overcome those political obstacles so that Venezuelans abroad can register and vote. Venezuelans in Colombia, Venezuelans in the United States need to be able to vote. The government, Maduro's administration does not have diplomats, recognized diplomats in Colombia or the United States. Therefore, there are no embassies in these countries. In order for Venezuelans to register in the electoral registry, they need to go to an embassy or a consulate. And if this political problem is not solved, Venezuelans abroad will not be able to register in order to vote in those two countries. Therefore, like Griselda said, we are working on this issue, on the issue of Venezuelans abroad, but in order for them to be able to vote, we need to overcome legal, technical, and political obstacles. And I'm sure that the UN assistance in order to develop such registry of voters abroad could be extremely valuable in this regard, because we're potentially talking about 4 million voters. Thank you very much, Domenico, Griselda, Eugenio. We have another round of questions on the chat, on the Q&A box, as well as on YouTube. We have a question here that says the following: if the result of the UN or the assistance is in the long term, what guarantees do we have so that the results in Venezuela are not basically trying to delay something, and it leads to more deaths in Venezuela? Another question: what could we expect in terms of results or expectations of the visit of the European Union that will take place in July? Would that be a positive expectation? I can answer Edward's question. I think that's very important. Not only on behalf of Foro Cívico, but also on in my more formal role, we need to understand the conflict in Venezuela. It has a political origin. How are we going to do so that the political will that Eugenia was mentioning in terms of registering voters abroad is something that will permeate all the different elements? For example, we are trying to make sure that we guarantee the political will to do so, and is something that lasts throughout time. We really need to insist in this regard. We do not have any certainty that this will happen, but we are fully convinced that this is our role. We are advocating for a peaceful, electoral, and democratic solution. That is what we want in Venezuela. That is why we are also working as Venezuelans, as the National Electoral Council, as civil society organizations monitoring the electoral issues in Venezuela. There is a lot we can do, but also the international community needs to get involved, multilateral organizations. We understand there are different procedures in place, there are different norms, but throughout this whole time, we've invited everyone to think out of the box, to understand that the situation in Venezuela, the crisis that we are undergoing, is grave. This crisis does not resemble any other crisis, and therefore we need to challenge the structures that are in place. We thought that they were very rigid and will ever be there, but we need to acknowledge that there are cracks and move forward in order to save lives and achieve sustainable peace. That is what we are working on. Thank you, Griselda. We have more questions. about the role of civil society organizations in terms of technical assistance and the expectations of the European Union's visit. I don't know if I can add 2 more questions, so please take note of them. We have Fabio Romero asking the questions. He's saying, will the European Union consider electoral assistance if technical guarantees are in place, even if there are no political guarantees, such as suspension of political parties? And there is another question by Edward Ocaris. What's the role to be played by the European Union and the United Nations with regard to an internal legal role as in terms of monitoring the LOP? Eugenio, then Domenico. In terms of technical guarantees over political guarantees, I have a couple of minutes here or to answer this question. In a few minutes or hours, there will be an announcement made in this regard. Re-establishing all political guarantees will not be possible in a single event, such as we have done in our such as we have said in our presentations, but we need to separate technical from political conditions. Hugo Chavez back in the day, and then Nicolas Maduro, as well as the former chair of the National Electoral Council, were very smart in terms of focusing the discussion on just very specific matters. In Venezuela, we had an automatized electoral system that was working and was in place, and that technical debate was basically ignoring all the different social and political demands. And we need to be very careful and separate all the different issues, especially those 2, because unavoidably, free, fair, and transparent elections depend on technical issues, of course, but also on certain political conditions.
So, in order to answer the other questions, I think that one of the positive results of the European Union's visit is to identify rules of procedure when it comes to observation missions, to open the door for them to return, not only for November 21st, but also for future electoral processes that we will be seeing in the near future. Thank you. Domenico? Yes, I feel that Eugenio's answers already covered many of the important points. As to the mission of the European Union, they have a specific term, exploratory mission, that assesses the conditions that need to be met to hold an electoral process, and there are different conditions. And the main role of that mission is to evaluate if they meet the necessary conditions. First of all, if there's support from the government, that guarantees security, but also a free movement of observers, not only part of the mission, but other national observers that might want to participate in the process. I think there was another question about the role of civil society. Well, it is essential for the European Union and for the UN to have observation coming from the public, from the general public. It's one of the essential elements that allow for a transparent process. We had in other cases, situations in which we have observed, in fact, that precondition to guarantee citizens' participation and to be able to also observe the process. So, when it comes to the European Union, it is essential to have these elements in place in order to reach a positive conclusion to these missions. I'm not sure if I covered everything else. We have 2 more questions, and I hope we have time. I'm not sure if Griselda wanted to add something. We're good? Okay. One of the questions had to do with the positive role of the European Union that could carry out their work jointly with the UN, but also the role of the international community and the Lima group, for example. What is their role in this process? Well, I could start so that we can do a full round. And when it comes to the last question, talking about the role of the international community, what we've always mentioned is that we need a coordinated action from different countries to see how we can actually achieve free elections and to identify a roadmap to a successful completion of this electoral process, and to understand that this is part of a cycle. It's not just an isolated event. Solving one isolated event will not lead us to solve that multidimensional crisis that our country is facing. So what I mentioned in my presentation, we need to have a joint message from European Union, the US, and Canada, for example, with that common message, with the aim of setting the ground so that the country can unravel, understand, and identify those points that had been blocked for many years. So I think that's the important thing. When it comes to the reaction after the CNE was elected, to have within the international framework a support for the entire process, not only have these exploratory missions come to the country, missions from the European Union, but rather have a participation from the UN, but also with these joint messages that serve as a support to the actions that we are carrying out within the country to guarantee free elections. So this should be observed from the different points of view and how complex the entire situation is, but also by identifying opportunities. I'm not sure if Eugenia and Dominica would like to also comment further, but I'm seeing comments from the chat, from colleagues from Foro Cívico, that highlight that this is a very long process to recover confidence in the system that will lead citizens to lead the way to recovery in terms of democracy and institutions. We have Maria Piñeiro as well that asks, that says, congratulations, Griselda. Thank you for being part of this team and creating these opportunities for Venezuelans. And there's another question for Domenico and Eugenio that has to do with trust, what Griselda was talking about, but trust from an international perspective. So why participate in a situation where there's lack of confidence in the system, and especially in the case of Venezuela, that is in a multidimensional crisis. So Eugenia, Domenico, your final comments. Domenico.
Al electoral siempre es apostar a como se dice, un proceso de largo plazo, como sacar una foto de lo que pasa en un país.
On or to participate on an electoral observation mission is to have a long-term perspective. So to have the opportunity to be able to shed light on what is happening in a country, especially during the election day, without limiting our focus on what is happening on that day, but having that broad vision of what we had lived throughout the years before the electoral process and what we will be going through in the following years. But to understand this, the effect of having an electoral observation mission, that effect, that impact will be lived throughout the following years. And it has a positive impact also from the standpoint of citizens and their perception of the process. So it's focusing on these activities, but with a long-term vision. Thank you, Domenico. I'm not sure if you wanted to also add, Eugenio, on what Domenico mentioned in terms of international communities' participation. I think their role is more relevant than ever, because what we need to bear in mind is that this is a long process, and we need to also rebuild institutions and several elements that were key to the process, either from the government's standpoint or from the civil society. So the participation of the international community, be it the European Union, the UN, or other institutions, to help us rebuild these institutions is essential. Because if we just focus our debate on one electoral procedure or process, either in November or the presidential elections in 2024, we will not be building a long-term condition that will guarantee governance. If we just focus on a key event, the effect will fade very soon. So what I believe is that we need to create those existing conditions to avoid any kind of abuse from the standpoint of whoever wins the elections, and whoever loses feels that they can be and continue to be part of the political life in the country to participate in future elections without generating additional trauma or reactions. So the international community can allow Venezuelans to create the necessary conditions to guarantee governance after elections. The issue is that at this point, we can have presidential elections, but what we need to look for is having the conditions in place, political conditions, or what have you, any kind of conditions that will allow us to transition into a democratic government. Thank you, Eugenio. But as we go over some of the comments we've seen online, I would like to ask speakers to also think about their closing remarks. So first of all, we have a comment that thanks us for highlighting the uncertainty Venezuelans are suffering of having different mixed messages every day. They continue onto the roadmap to participate in democracy. And it is necessary in these terms to have free and fair elections that generate an opportunity for civil society to recover trust in the system. And thank you for Civico, and thank you all for your great efforts. We have words from Daisy Trejo. Thank you for such a relevant event. Thank you for Civico and for Activo. Thank you for their support in the creation of the CNE and the reinstitution of democracy as part of a process to recovery. Eliminating the protectorate was also a key element to make progress, to create spaces for the civil society. So with this, we would like to share final words so that you can also close this session, starting with the same order that we started the event. Eugenio, Domenico, and Grisella. Okay, so I think it's necessary to continue insisting on the importance of the European Union's support in the Venezuelans' electoral process. And Domenico explained that this starts with a formal invitation from the Venezuelan government. But with the many results and benefits it can generate, as guaranteeing a fair electoral process, defending Venezuelans' rights to a fair election, their participation is essential. And they also need to identify the best way to participate and cooperate in this process. It could be by supporting initiatives that will allow Venezuelans to participate in the session, in the process, either through recovering their identity, any documentation that will guarantee their identity, or register to vote. And it's essential also to highlight how important it is for the international community not to look the other way, but to be present in such a determining moment. Thank you, Domenico. I like that expression of recovery of democracy. And this starts with the support of the international community. In spite of what we aspire to achieve, this has to be a daily exercise. And it started with the appointment of the new CNE, and to also give visibility to all the achievements. And within this process, I would like to highlight these audits that were recommended by the European Union in 2005 and that were pending ever since. Carrying out these audits is essential, and to give visibility to this would be one of the strongest messages we can give to international organizations.
Imposible en los pasados años. Que esté pasando en ese momento, que no se conozca, decimos, de forma...
Comprehensive audit has been impossible over the last years, so we need to work on this at a global level. So this process has already started, and we hope it will continue. Thank you. Griselda, the floor is yours. Thank you. I would like to thank everyone for this opportunity, everyone's participation, and Domenico and Eugenio for sharing this panel with me. At the beginning of last year, our main fear, and I said this at the time, was for Venezuela to become a neglected emergency because of that political situation that we had in Venezuela. We've overcome that. Now we've managed to mobilize the political scene. Today, we are talking about the possibility of rebuilding a path towards fair elections. We're talking about the possibility of electoral assistance. We are thinking, we are seeing how recommendations that were issued are being implemented. We are seeing this at the National Electoral Council. There is an adverse situation. The moment is fragile. The situation is fragile. There's a lot of work ahead of us, but we are moving forward along that path. I would like to invite all Venezuelans to come with us on this path, to understand the process, to understand how to participate in an electoral process that goes beyond voting. Citizens must play an active role under an electoral framework. It has to do with engagement in different entities, such as like electoral colleges, at a municipal level, Venezuelans need to be there, need to train themselves about what role they have to play. That is how everyone can contribute to build a better democracy in Venezuela, because democracy is not built only by isolated political leaders, but through the participation precisely of all citizens. Thank you, Griselda. Thank you, Domenico and Eugenio. I see some final comments to thank speakers for their presentations. And I would also like to echo those expressions of gratitude, as well as the message that Domenico shared. If someone needs to be rescued, is precisely an active civil society, citizens that think and work on the issues regarding the different multidimensional crises that are active in Venezuela. Elections are key in order to recover democracy, and that is why we are documenting the situation and defending our rights, but we are also engaging with the different stakeholders. This discussion precisely addresses international stakeholders. We want them to know that organizations in civil society are working, but that we need their support, their assistance in order to be able to walk this path. We believe that it is possible to build this jointly with everyone's involvement, and we are addressing this from Foro Cívico as well as every single organization that is part of it. We will continue to do so. And through spaces like this, we just want to raise awareness and bring visibility to our work so that we can inspire those that want to solve the democratic crisis in Venezuela through peaceful and electoral means supported by humanitarian assistance. All those are very important mechanisms that are absolutely necessary, that need to be in place, and therefore we need to coordinate among ourselves, taking into account the situation in Venezuela. With this, I would like to bring to an end this event, and also I would like to invite you to engage with our social media, where we will share messages about what we are doing, our work on all these issues. We continue to work hard, and I look forward to seeing you again in different events. This work will continue all the way to November, and we hope at the time we will see the electoral and technical assistance that we need in Venezuela. Thank you all, and stay tuned through social media, through your email.
Y agradecidos por su participación.
Thank you. Thank you for participating in today's event.